My name is Isabelle Carter. I'm 34 years old, an interior designer based in Austin, Texas. For the past 5 years, I've quietly covered the mortgage on my parents' home, the same home where I took my first steps, carved my name into the closet door, and once believed love lived in every corner. I paid without hesitation, telling myself I was protecting the place that held my childhood and my family together. If you've ever sacrificed for family only to be left out when it mattered most, drop a comment, hit that like button, and subscribe to the channel. And please, share this story with someone who needs to know they're not alone. I wasn't prepared for what happened next. Naomi, my younger sister by 5 years, was marrying Brandon Whitmore, the golden boy of a family that owns half the car dealerships in Central Texas. The wedding was held at the Driscoll Hotel downtown, dripping in crystals and imported orchids, a celebration so lavish I couldn't begin to imagine the cost. I had spent the morning fussing over Naomi's veil and reminding the makeup artist to keep her eyeliner waterproof. I adjusted centerpieces, fetched champagne, and kept smiles in place while my sister's every whim was treated like gospel. I told myself I was doing it for peace, for family. The ballroom swelled with applause after their first dance. Naomi's dress shimmered under the chandeliers. Everyone leaned in when our father, Charles, stood at the head table with his glass raised, the familiar twinkle in his eyes. I smiled, expecting the usual toast, a story about her childhood, maybe a joke about her always getting her way. But then he said it. "Your mother and I have been thinking a lot about the future, about what it means to build a foundation for a new family. And so," he paused, glancing toward Naomi and Brandon, "we've decided to give you the house, the one on Willow Lane. It's yours now, to build memories just like we did." The air rushed out of my lungs. The room erupted with cheers, forks clinking against glasses, and Naomi buried her face in Brandon's shoulder, sobbing with joy. My mother beamed beside her, soaking in the moment as if she had just handed over a kingdom. I sat frozen. I hadn't been consulted, not once, not even a warning. For 5 years, I had transferred that mortgage payment on the first of every month, quietly, dutifully, while they promised someday the house would be mine, that it was still part of my future. I felt my fingers tightening around the stem of the champagne flute. It trembled slightly, but I refused to let it fall. In that moment, surrounded by clapping guests and glimmering lights, I realized something sharp and painful. This wasn't just a gift, it was a betrayal. And that night would mark the beginning of everything unraveling. Because the daughter they expected to stay quiet, she was gone. Looking back, I can't say the wedding moment came out of nowhere. The signs were always there, quiet, subtle, wrapped in ribbons and justifications. You don't see the storm when you've been raised in it. You just learn how to hold your breath longer. Naomi and I were born 5 years apart, but it felt like 2 different families raised us. We grew up in a modest 2-story home on Willow Lane. It wasn't grand, but it was filled with things that felt permanent: creaking floors, Sunday pancakes, the hum of the ceiling fan in summer. My dad, Charles, worked as a CPA for small businesses. My mom, Elaine, was a 3rd-grade teacher at the local elementary school and the queen of photo albums and birthday themes. When I turned 10, I asked for a sleepover party. 3 girls, homemade cupcakes, movies in the living room. But Mom said it was too expensive and pared it down to just 1 friend and store-bought cake. I understood. Money was tight. I never questioned it. 3 months later, for Naomi's 5th birthday, our backyard exploded in color. Balloons, a clown, a rented bounce house, even a glitter tattoo artist. It looked like a county fair. I remember standing on the back porch, plastic cup in hand, trying to understand how the rules had changed. At first, I chalked it up to Naomi being the baby. Everyone dotes on the youngest, right? That's what I told myself again and again, when I had to wait a year for braces so the insurance would cover more. But Naomi got hers immediately. When my 16th birthday came and I got driving lessons, and 5 years later, Naomi received a gently used Honda Civic with a big red bow. Whenever I asked, politely, cautiously, my parents had reasons. Finances have improved, they'd say. Or, she needs a little more help than you do. And most often, you're just so independent. That word followed me like a shadow. Independent. What they didn't see was how much it cost me. By the time I was in high school, I knew that if I wanted something, I'd need to earn it myself. So I started babysitting at 14, then added a cashier job at the hardware store 2 years later. While Naomi napped after school, I folded uniforms and counted change, already learning how to carry weight without complaint. It became normal. Expected. I didn't rebel. I adapted. Even when it hurt. And Naomi? She just had to keep her grades average. That was enough. So when I sat frozen in that ballroom years later, champagne flute trembling, it wasn't only about the house. It was everything that house represented, every childhood moment where I accepted less and smiled through it. I had trained myself to be okay with being invisible, but that night, something cracked. It wasn't just childhood that taught me to do without. It was everything that followed. The way independence became a requirement, not a virtue. After years of watching Naomi get handed what I had to earn, I stopped expecting fairness. I stopped asking. I started working young, not because I wanted pocket money, but because I needed to believe I could control something. At 14, I babysat for 3 families in the neighborhood. At 16, I picked up weekend shifts at the local hardware store, memorizing SKU numbers and learning to smile through exhaustion. My parents were proud, in the abstract way you're proud of a kid who doesn't cause trouble. But their support was always verbal, never material. When I started touring colleges, they gave me a hard truth. "We can contribute a little," my dad said, "but you'll need to handle the rest." So I did. I chose University of Texas, not my dream school, but the one I could afford with a partial scholarship, student loans, and 3 part-time jobs. During the week, I attended design lectures and worked in the campus bookstore. On weekends, I bartended at a dim corner spot downtown, getting home after midnight and collapsing onto a borrowed futon in my shared apartment. There were nights I cried from exhaustion, mornings I showed up to class without sleep, smelling faintly of tequila and cheap hand soap, but quitting was never an option. I didn't have the safety net Naomi had. Because while I was skipping meals to save money, Naomi was exploring majors at a private college in Colorado, her tuition paid in full. My parents told me she wouldn't manage student loans. "She's not built for that kind of pressure," Mom said. "You're stronger. You always have been." Strong, independent, responsible. Words that sound like compliments until you realize they're being used to excuse neglect. I graduated without fanfare, no big celebration, just a quiet dinner and a card from my parents with a check for $100. Naomi got a catered backyard party with custom cookies shaped like diplomas. I told myself I didn't need the attention. I had goals, and they didn't include applause. But something shifted in me that year. I stopped waiting for my parents to catch up to who I'd become. I didn't know it yet, but that shift would be the foundation of everything that came next. The career, the condo, the quiet resolve that carried me through betrayal. Because the girl they called independent was already learning to stand entirely on her own. Graduating without debt was never in the cards for me, but building something real? That was. And so I did what I always had. I worked. I pushed. I kept going even when everything told me to stop. The only difference now was the size of the stakes. I graduated in 2010, right into the teeth of a brutal recession. Design jobs were scarce. Creative firms were laying people off, not hiring. I sent out over 200 resumes and got 2 interviews, both of which ended with polite no's and vague encouragement. So I took what I could get. A receptionist position at a tile and hardware showroom on the outskirts of Austin. I answered phones, I fetched coffee, I memorized product SKUs and delivery schedules. On lunch breaks, I stayed in the back room sketching dream kitchens and staging imaginary remodels. At night, I enrolled in certification courses, lighting, 3D rendering, color theory, whatever I could afford. My weekends disappeared into freelance gigs, redesigning a friend's guest room, painting murals in nurseries, staging homes for realtors who barely looked at me but loved my results. I lived in a one-bedroom apartment that smelled faintly of mildew and was always either too hot or too cold. My car broke down so often the mechanic started giving me rides home. I skipped dinners, I patched shoes instead of buying new ones, and still, no one in my family asked if I needed help. When I'd visit home for Sunday dinner, they'd praise Naomi's latest creative pursuit, a photography workshop, a blog about crystals, her short-lived Etsy shop for custom dream catchers. She was finding herself. Meanwhile, I was losing pieces of me to exhaustion, but I stayed quiet. Because to them, I was doing fine, because I never let them see me sweat, because I thought that if I just worked hard enough, they'd finally notice. Everything changed in year 3. A client came into the showroom looking to remodel her vacation home on Lake Austin. Her designer had dropped out last minute, and I, desperate and overprepared, offered to help. I presented mood boards, samples, even a lighting plan on the spot. She gave me a shot. That one project led to 3 referrals, then 6. By the end of that year, I was no longer behind a desk. I was designing full-time with a client list that finally respected my talent. I moved into a brighter apartment. I leased a reliable car. I opened my own small studio in East Austin and started hiring help. I was still tired, but for the first time, I felt seen. Not by my family, not yet, but by the world outside of them. And that mattered more than I realized. The shift came quietly, like most things in my family. No dramatic announcement, no sudden collapse, just a single phone call that changed everything. It was late September, and I was working late in my studio in East Austin, finalizing mock-ups for a lakeside renovation project. I remember the glow of my desk lamp, the hum of silence, the soft buzz of my phone lighting up with Dad's name. I almost didn't answer, but something in me said, "Pick up." His voice was softer than usual, hesitant. "Hey, sweetheart, you got a minute?" That phrase, so casual, sat on top of something heavy. I could hear it in the pause that followed. Then came the words, "They let me go. After 30 years with the firm. Downsizing. I got a small severance package, but things are tight right now." He didn't ask for help, not outright. That wasn't his way, but the undertone was clear. And still, I waited. I waited for him to say, "I'm sorry," or even, "We're proud of how far you've come," before asking for anything. But those words never came. What came instead was silence. And then, "Your mom's been having a harder time too. Her joints have been acting up. She's had to cut back on hours." I closed my laptop. That night, I drove to Willow Lane for the first time in months. The house looked smaller than I remembered. The porch light flickered, a detail I'd have fixed immediately if it were mine. Inside, Mom was sitting with a heating pad pressed to her knees, pretending to read. There were unopened bills tucked between a stack of magazines on the coffee table. They hadn't meant for me to see them, but I did. Final notices, missed payments, medical statements with totals I couldn't unsee. When I asked about it, they both shrugged like it was temporary. "We're managing," Dad said. "Just a little bump." But their faces told a different story, tight with worry, eyes that didn't quite meet mine. I went home that night and didn't sleep. I kept thinking about how they'd told me over and over again that the house was part of my future, that someday it would be mine, and how, if they lost it now, everything I had worked to preserve, the memories, the legacy, would vanish. The next morning, I called my bank and set up monthly mortgage transfers directly to their account. Quietly. Without fanfare. Without even asking for anything in return. When I told them later that week, Mom started crying. "We'll pay you back," she said, clutching my hand. "This is still your inheritance. We'll never forget this." I believed her. At the time, I truly did. And that belief, that willingness to carry the weight for all of us, would become both my biggest strength and the most painful lesson I would ever learn. I thought it would be temporary, a few months, maybe a year, just until Dad found work again, until Mom's health stabilized. I didn't see it as a burden. It felt like a natural extension of who I was. The fixer, the reliable one, the daughter who didn't ask for much and always came through. The first payment was $1,342. I remember the exact number because I triple-checked the transfer before pressing submit. I told myself I wasn't just helping them, I was protecting something sacred. The house, the memories, the story I'd always believed we were building together. But months passed, and nothing changed. Dad picked up some consulting work with a small business downtown, but it was irregular. And with no benefits, every unexpected medical bill fell straight into my lap. Mom's condition grew worse that winter. The cold made her joints swell, and I'd find her wrapped in layers, wincing through movements she used to do with ease. So I adjusted. I covered utilities, then groceries, then home repairs when the water heater failed. At first, they'd protest. A little. But eventually it became routine. Every month I'd send over just enough to keep things afloat. Every visit, I'd quietly scrub out the fridge, tighten a loose cabinet hinge, refill the medicine drawer. They started leaving lists for me, casually, folded into the corners of kitchen conversations. "We've been thinking about replacing the gutters," Dad would say, "but only if it's in the budget." "We're almost out of that joint supplement. Would you mind grabbing it next time?" Mom would ask, smiling sweetly as if it was no trouble at all. And maybe it wasn't. Not at first, because I still believed the house was part of my future. Every time I looked at the window where we used to hang paper snowflakes or the dent in the hallway wall from Naomi's tricycle, I reminded myself, this matters. This is worth it. I was investing in something lasting. Even when Naomi's presence became less and less frequent. She'd show up for Christmas, birthdays, the occasional Sunday brunch when it suited her. She brought gifts, candles, cute kitchen towels, and posted filtered photos with captions like, "Nothing like family time." She never asked how the mortgage was getting paid, never offered to chip in, and my parents never brought it up, because in their eyes, I was managing. I always managed. They didn't see the plans I'd put on hold, the second property I never bought, the business expansion I delayed, the way my own dreams bent around theirs like vines trying to find the sun. But still, I told myself it was worth it, because the house would come back to me, because they'd said it, "This is still your inheritance," and I believed people meant what they said. Back then, I still believed a lot of things. While I adjusted my budget, canceled weekend plans, and rerouted money meant for my future, Naomi floated through hers with the grace of someone who had never once felt the ground beneath her crack. She never knew what it felt like to open a medical bill and feel your chest tighten. She didn't understand the small shame that came with checking your bank account 3 times before committing to a gift for Mother's Day, and she never asked. Naomi was the type who always landed softly. After college, she came back to Austin in a haze of optimism and vague ambitions. For a while, she worked at an art gallery. Then she left, saying it didn't align with her spirit. She spent a few months exploring creative consulting, then dabbled in energy healing before finally settling on yoga. Not running a studio, just teaching a few classes a week at an upscale gym where the eucalyptus towels were thicker than any blanket I owned at the time. And somehow, none of it seemed to shake her. She lived in a sunny apartment downtown with skyline views and an ever-rotating collection of houseplants she named. Brunches were a weekly ritual. Weekends meant wine tastings or short getaways to Marfa. Her Instagram was a dreamy collage of golden hour selfies, lattes, and affirmations about self-love. And the bills? Covered. I knew, even if no one said it aloud. My parents still paid her phone plan. I overheard Dad once mention helping with rent when she came up short. Mom once confided she'd slipped Naomi a few $100s for a wellness retreat in Sedona. Meanwhile, I was cutting back therapy sessions to stretch a payment that was never supposed to be mine in the first place, but I didn't say anything. Because calling it out would make me the difficult one, the jealous one, the bitter older sister who couldn't just be happy for the family. So I stayed silent. I watched Naomi arrive at holidays with flashy gifts and expensive wine, praised for her generosity even as she handed over things she didn't pay for. I watched my parents' eyes light up when she walked into a room, how they leaned in when she spoke, laughed harder at her jokes, gave her attention like it was oxygen, and she was always the one running out of air. I'd help Mom with dishes while Naomi lounged on the couch, scrolling through her phone. I'd clear the table, refill drinks, check the thermostat, tighten a loose chair leg. I'd disappear into the background and convince myself it was love that made me useful. But deep down, something in me was changing. The quiet burn of resentment wasn't just flickering, it was growing, slow and steady, waiting for oxygen. I didn't want what Naomi had. I didn't want her filtered life or curated freedom. I just wanted my efforts to mean something. I wanted acknowledgement, not applause, not trophies, just a simple, honest recognition that I was holding things together, and that maybe, just maybe, it was time for someone to ask how I was doing. I didn't meet Brandon right away. I heard about him first, filtered through Naomi's breathless updates and our mother's glowing commentary. The kind of man who seemed to arrive not just in Naomi's life, but into our family's narrative like a polished punctuation mark. Proof that she had, once again, landed on her feet. They met at a charity gala Naomi attended with one of her yoga clients. He was tall, charming, came from money, one of those old Austin families with a name etched into plaques downtown and a long history in luxury car dealerships. "He's different," Naomi said one afternoon while twirling her hair on the back porch, a glass of wine dangling from her fingers. "Brandon listens when I talk. He understands my energy." I bit back a dozen replies, none of them helpful. Instead, I smiled, offered a neutral, "That's great," and kept folding laundry while my brain screamed. Because suddenly, everyone had energy again. My parents, who barely left the house on cold days and often declined dinner invites citing too much hassle, started going out again, to brunch, to art shows, to tastings, always when Brandon was around. My mother, who'd complained just months earlier that her hands hurt too much to cook, hosted a dinner for Brandon and his parents complete with cloth napkins and her signature roast chicken. The same woman who'd turned down a walk around the block with me claimed she'd found a second wind. I watched them transform for him, charming, gracious, almost unrecognizable. And it hurt more than I expected. Naomi had brought home boyfriends before, but Brandon changed something. He wasn't just a partner, he was a project, a future, an elevation. And my parents were all in. I remember one night in particular, after a dinner where Brandon had regaled everyone with stories of his family's ranch in Fredericksburg and his plans to open a boutique auto showroom in SoCo. As we were saying goodbye, my mom hugged Naomi a little longer, whispering, "He's such a good match for you. I can see you building a beautiful life with him." She never said that to me. Not after I launched my business. Not after I renovated my studio with my own two hands. Not when I landed my biggest client to date. Because I didn't have a Brandon. I didn't have a last name with weight behind it, or a partner who made people sit up straighter. I had grit. I had spreadsheets. I had exhaustion. But beautiful? That was reserved for Naomi. From then on, every family interaction became wrapped in Brandon's shadow, and every time I saw my parents light up around him, I felt myself slipping further out of focus. What I didn't realize then, what I couldn't have known, was that this wasn't just about a man. This was the beginning of something much bigger, something I wouldn't fully see until the day they handed him everything I had spent years preserving. It didn't take long after Brandon entered the picture for things to accelerate. By spring, barely 6 months after their first date, Naomi had a diamond the size of a thumbnail and a hashtagged engagement announcement that lit up social media for days. Hashtag Naomi and Brandon forever. What it really meant was that my family's center of gravity shifted. Again. I didn't expect to be the focus. I never was. But I didn't expect to feel so completely on the outside either, like the child pressed against a window, watching everyone else play inside. The engagement party was held at the Leland Club, one of those hilltop venues west of Austin with panoramic views and too many valet attendants. Brandon's family had connections there, naturally. The guest list included executives, gallery owners, and more people with hyphenated last names than I could count. I almost didn't go. I had 2 project deadlines that week, but Mom insisted. "It's important we show up united," she said, and I foolishly thought that meant all of us. I arrived in a sleek black dress I'd worn for a client gala just a month before. Understated but elegant. I carried a gift, even had it wrapped with gold ribbon, something Naomi wouldn't notice, but Mom would. Inside, everything sparkled. Glassware, centerpieces, Brandon's smile. Naomi flitted through the room like she owned it. And maybe, in a way, she did. My parents were already deep in conversation with Brandon's family when I found them. Their eyes lit up when they saw me, but it faded quickly. There was a flutter of introductions, a quick, "Isabelle's the older sister," and then the moment passed. I hovered near the edge of the group, sipping champagne and listening, trying to feel like I belonged. That's when I heard it. My mother, standing just a few feet away with a group of Brandon's aunts, said, "The wedding gift is going to be absolutely perfect, something they can truly build their future on." The words didn't sting at first. I assumed she meant something figurative. Wisdom, maybe furniture. But the way the women nodded, the way one of them clutched her pearls and said, "Oh, how meaningful," made my stomach turn. When I asked Mom about it later, she laughed, deflecting. "Nothing's set in stone yet, just ideas. Have you tried the crab cakes?" But I couldn't shake the unease, especially not after noticing the way my parents and Brandon's parents kept slipping away for hushed conversations. The glances, the forced smiles. They were planning something, and whatever it was, I wasn't meant to be part of it. It wasn't just that Naomi was getting married, it was the speed, the secrecy, and the sudden way everything that had once been shared, even unspoken understandings, became theirs, not mine. I tried to focus on the work that week, but the feeling lingered. Something was shifting again. And I knew, deep down, that this time it wouldn't shift back. After the engagement party, I tried to brush off the unease. Maybe I was overthinking. Maybe the champagne had made me overly sensitive. But the feeling kept tugging at me, quiet and insistent, like a draft through a cracked window you can't quite find. A week later, Dad called and asked if I could increase my monthly support, just for a bit. "The roof's showing signs of wear," he said. "We've got a contractor coming by to give an estimate. Nothing urgent, but we'd rather handle it before the weather shifts." I didn't hesitate. I transferred an extra $2,000 that afternoon. But when I stopped by their house that weekend to drop off a new humidifier for Mom, I didn't see a single ladder, tarp, or contractor van. No patchwork, no tools. The roof looked exactly the same. Inside, Mom and Naomi were seated at the dining room table, surrounded by swatches of fabric and wedding magazines. A bottle of champagne sat half-empty near a stack of catering menus, and the air smelled faintly of vanilla candles and tension. They looked up like I'd caught them doing something they weren't supposed to, except they weren't apologetic, just mildly surprised. "Just getting some initial ideas," Mom said, quickly gathering the mess into a pile. "Nothing extravagant." But I saw the quote sitting open on the table, $112 per plate, not including appetizers or bar service. I did the math in my head and felt my stomach twist. When I asked about the roof, Mom blinked. "Oh, right. We're still waiting on the contractor. You know how slow things move in this town?" The deflection was obvious, the shift in subject even more so. I let it go in the moment, or at least I pretended to, but my mind kept circling back to the numbers, the favors, the timing, and most of all, the quiet way my financial support had stopped being temporary and started becoming a silent expectation. At lunch the following week, I confided in Jenna. my best friend since college. We sat at our usual spot downtown, pushing half-eaten salads around as I laid it all out. Am I crazy for feeling weird about this? I asked. I mean, they're my parents. I want to help them, but something feels off. She didn't hesitate. You're not crazy. You're enabling them. The words stung because they rang true. You've been paying their mortgage, utilities, medical bills for years, she said, leaning in. And now they're suddenly flush enough for a high-end wedding? Has anyone even mentioned paying you back? I shook my head. That wasn't the arrangement. I never asked for repayment. No, but you expected honesty, she said. And maybe a little gratitude. I didn't respond. Because what could I say? That deep down I thought I was investing in something that mattered? That I thought the house was my future? That every sacrifice came with an unspoken promise? That week, I found myself rereading old texts from Mom. Little things. We'll never forget what you're doing for us. This home is still yours someday. We're just getting through this rough patch. But the patch wasn't ending, and suddenly I wasn't sure if it had ever been real. I kept telling myself I was imagining it, that I was too tired, too close to it all, that maybe I was projecting years of buried resentment onto harmless moments. But the truth has a way of slipping through, especially when you're not supposed to see it. It was 6 weeks before the wedding. I had just finished a client meeting in South Austin and decided to swing by Willow Lane to drop off an early birthday gift for Mom. I hadn't told them I was coming. It was the kind of surprise visit I used to make all the time, before everything started feeling off. When I pulled into the driveway, their cars weren't there. But the front porch light was on, and I saw shadows moving through the front window. I used my key, yes, I still had one, and stepped inside. "Hello?" I called carefully, not wanting to startle anyone. There was a pause, then hurried voices. I followed the sound into the dining room, and what I saw stopped me cold. Mom, Dad, and an older man in a gray suit were seated at the table. Papers were spread out between them, and Dad looked up like he'd been caught mid-theft. "Heather, we weren't expecting you," Mom said quickly, her voice high and tight, the way it always got when she was nervous. I blinked. "I just came by to drop off your gift." "This is Mr. Langston," Dad added, motioning awkwardly to the man in the suit. "Our attorney. He's just helping us get some paperwork in order." Mr. Langston gave me a polite nod, but didn't say a word. There was a beat of silence. Then Mom stood and forced a smile. "Let's get some coffee going." She practically ushered me into the kitchen, leaving the dining room door slightly ajar. I could still see the edge of the folder Mr. Langston had been reading from, the corner of a document stamped with something official. I watched as Mom busied herself wiping an already clean countertop, opening and closing drawers, avoiding my eyes. "Everything okay?" I asked gently. "You're not selling the house or anything, right?" She laughed, too loudly. "Of course not. Don't be silly. We're just simplifying, getting affairs in order. You know, at our age, it's responsible." Before I could press further, Dad appeared with 2 mugs and a practiced calm. "Nothing to worry about, sweetheart. Actually, good news. You won't have to worry about the house soon." I froze. "What does that mean?" He waved a hand. "Just that we're making a few adjustments. Nothing to concern yourself with right now." My heart thudded. Their avoidance was no longer subtle, and that sinking feeling in my stomach, the one I'd been ignoring, wasn't going away this time. We made polite small talk for another 20 minutes. They asked about my studio, about a client they remembered, about Naomi's wedding menu. But the warmth was performative. A cover. As I left, I glanced back through the front window. The papers were gone. The dining table was cleared, and Mr. Langston's car was already reversing down the drive. Something was being decided behind closed doors, and I was being intentionally left out. By the time the wedding day arrived, the knot in my stomach had hardened into something dense and immovable. I hadn't brought it up again, Not the attorney, not the papers, not the way they'd both dodged my questions. There hadn't been time or space, or maybe I just didn't want the confirmation. But deep down, I already knew. The wedding was held at the historic Fairmont Hotel in downtown Austin. The venue had been transformed into a soft, glimmering dream. Thousands of white roses, golden uplighting, a string quartet playing beneath a chandelier that probably cost more than my first year of rent. As a bridesmaid, I'd been there since sunrise, weaving through hairstylists, makeup artists, and Naomi's ever-fluctuating emotions. The veil wasn't laying right. The champagne wasn't cold enough. At one point, she burst into tears because the photographer used the wrong filter for her pre-ceremony shots. Mom pulled me aside mid-morning, her voice low. "Please, just help make this perfect for your sister. Just for today." So I did. I held her hand during the shoe crisis. I fluffed her gown. I made jokes to diffuse tension and tracked down the wedding planner when the place cards were misaligned. I was the invisible thread stitching the whole production together, never seen but always expected to hold. The ceremony was flawless. Naomi walked down the aisle like she'd descended from a bridal magazine spread. Brandon beamed. The crowd awed at every perfect cue. And when they kissed, the room erupted in applause like it had all been choreographed. The reception glowed with soft light and delicate clinking of glassware. I sat at the family table, nursing a champagne flute and trying to pretend I wasn't waiting for something. Because I was. And it came after the main course. Dad stood up and tapped his glass for attention. A hush fell over the room as he held the microphone in both hands, his voice filled with the kind of emotion I hadn't heard from him in years. He spoke about love, about legacy, about the importance of building a foundation, of setting the next generation up for success. And then he said it. "And so, as our wedding gift to Naomi and Brandon, your mother and I have decided to give you our home on Willow Lane, the place where our family began, the place filled with laughter and memories. It's now yours, to make your own." The applause was instant, thunderous. Naomi gasped theatrically, placing a hand over her mouth before collapsing into Brandon's shoulder, tears streaming down her cheeks. Mom dabbed her eyes. Brandon's parents looked on with admiration. The entire table buzzed with praise. So generous, so meaningful. How beautiful. I didn't move, not a word, not a breath. I stared down at the condensation on my champagne glass, watching it slide in slow rivulets like everything I'd built was slipping with it. They had given away the house I had been paying for. 5 years of mortgage payments, 5 years of utilities, groceries, repairs, late-night pharmacy runs, 5 years of swallowed pride and sacrificed milestones. All of it, handed off like a bow on a gift bag. And they hadn't said a word, not even a warning. I forced a smile when Naomi hugged me, her face glowing with joy. I even posed for photos, raised a glass for the toasts, and clapped politely when Brandon spun her across the floor during their first dance. But inside, something broke, and this time, I wasn't going to tape it back together. I stayed just long enough to be polite. I smiled for the group photos, helped clean up a minor spill near the cake table, and even gave Naomi a genuine compliment about her gown. No one noticed that my voice had gone quieter. Or maybe they did, but they chalked it up to overwork or wedding fatigue. When the DJ called for the father-daughter dance, I slipped out the side exit, heels in hand, heart thudding against my ribs. I didn't go home. I drove straight to Willow Lane. The street was quiet, washed in silver from a nearly full moon. I parked in the driveway, my usual spot, and sat there for a few minutes, staring at the house that had once held everything I loved, everything I protected, and now it belonged to someone else. The porch light was still on when I saw Mom and Dad's car pull up. They were still in their formal wear, my father's tie loosened, Mom's heels dangling from her hand. When they saw me, they both froze. I stepped out of the car and met them halfway up the walk. "We need to talk," I said, my voice low but steady. Inside, the house was still dressed in remnants of the wedding, extra favors, framed engagement photos, floral arrangements slowly wilting in vases. It felt like someone else's home now. We settled into the living room. I didn't sit. How could you give away the house I've been paying for without even telling me? Silence. Then Dad let out a slow exhale, loosening his collar. It's our house, Isabelle. I blinked. Was it your name on the checks every month? Was it your account that covered the roof repair, the back taxes, the groceries? Mom crossed her arms. We never asked you to do all that. My voice cracked. No, you didn't. But you let me believe I was doing it for a reason. That this was still my future. Mom, you said it was my inheritance. Plans change. That's what Dad said next. Just like that. As if what they'd done was no more than rearranging furniture. Naomi and Brandon need a place to start their lives, he added. They can't afford a house like this on their own. And you already have your condo, your business. You're fine. That word? Again. Fine. Like that's all I was ever supposed to be. The one who didn't need help. The one who didn't complain. I stepped back, shaking. You didn't just give them a house. You gave them my investment. My sacrifice. You erased me. Mom stood. Don't be dramatic. It's not like we kicked you out. You didn't have to, I said. You already decided I didn't count. The pain in my chest felt physical, sharp, radiating behind my ribs. And still, I held their eyes. I won't be helping anymore, I said finally. Not with this house, not with your bills, not with anything. Dad's expression shifted, part insult, part disbelief. So, you're cutting us off? I'm setting boundaries, I replied. Something I should have done years ago. And with that, I turned and walked out the door. The air outside was cool against my skin, like I'd stepped out of a fever dream. For the first time in years, I wasn't walking away from that house as the caretaker, the savior, the quiet provider. I was walking away as someone who finally saw the truth, and I wasn't going back. The next morning, the silence was louder than any argument. I woke up in my condo on the east side of Austin, the one I bought entirely on my own. No texts, no calls, not even a passive-aggressive, hope you got home safe. Just silence, stretched across my phone like a final verdict. At first, I thought I'd feel relief. Instead, there was this dull ache in my chest, like I'd finally removed a splinter but still felt the phantom sting. I made coffee, let it go cold, checked emails, then closed the laptop again. My reflection in the window looked unfamiliar. Not broken, just unanchored. The house was no longer my responsibility. My parents were no longer my obligation. But when you've spent your entire adult life being the fixer, letting go can feel like grief. Later that afternoon, the first email came in, from the mortgage company. Apparently, Dad had removed my automatic payments without informing me, which meant one thing: they were planning to handle it themselves now. Or maybe they assumed Naomi and Brandon would. Part of me wanted to ignore it, just hit archive and move on. But another part, the one that had seen too many unpaid bills and late-night emergencies, knew better. So I called the number listed, verified my information, and officially took my name off the account. It was over. For real. By Thursday, Naomi posted a carousel of honeymoon photos from Santorini, matching white linen outfits, champagne on a balcony, captions filled with #blessed and #new beginnings. Not a word about the house, not a single thank you, just the performance of perfection. And then came the ripple. Aunt Caroline called, her voice cautious. "Sweetheart, I had no idea about the house. Your dad made it sound like it was theirs to give. Are you okay?" It was the first time in a long time someone asked me that, and actually waited for the answer. I didn't cry. Not right then. But after we hung up, I sat down on my bedroom floor, cross-legged like a kid, and let myself finally feel it all. The betrayal, the loneliness, the absurdity of it, That I had poured so much of myself into a family that saw me not as a daughter, but as a resource, a dependable ATM with a pleasant smile. I stayed on that floor until the sun dipped behind the skyline, streaking the sky in oranges and purples. And when I stood back up, something inside me had shifted. I wasn't powerless. They took advantage of me. But I had also allowed it. For years. Out of guilt, out of longing, out of some naive belief that love looked like sacrifice without limits. No more. That night, I started a list in a leather-bound journal I hadn't touched in months, a list of every boundary I would no longer cross, of every person I'd silently carried who now needed to walk on their own. And at the top of the page, I wrote in bold ink, "This is the year I reclaim my life, because love shouldn't cost your self-worth. And family, real family, doesn't thrive on silence and debt, it thrives on truth." Just when I thought the silence meant peace, they showed up at my door. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I was mid-laundry, wearing an old college hoodie, music playing low in the background. The kind of day where you breathe easier, where nothing demands more than your presence. I was folding towels when the doorbell rang. At first, I thought it might be a neighbor or a package. But when I opened the door, my stomach dropped. Standing there, on the welcome mat I'd bought last spring that read, "Boundaries are beautiful," were my parents. Mom was holding a Tupperware container, like it was some kind of peace offering. Dad looked like he had just come from the golf course, sunglasses perched on his head, arms crossed like he wasn't the one who'd handed away my future. "Hi, honey," Mom said, forcing a smile. I didn't move. "What are you doing here?" "We thought we could talk," Dad said, stepping forward. "About everything. Maybe over lunch?" I stood frozen. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I finally realized I wasn't scared of confrontation anymore. Not with them. Not with anyone who thought love came with strings. I stepped outside, closing the door behind me, but not inviting them in. "There's nothing to talk about," I said quietly. I meant what I said. I'm done. Mom's expression twisted, like I'd just slapped her. "You're really going to throw away your family over a house?" That word again. Throw away. "No," I said. "You did that when you handed over everything I built to someone who contributed nothing." Dad bristled. "We thought you'd understand. Naomi's just starting out. You've already made it." I almost laughed. Made it? I've been drowning quietly for years while you praised her for floating. I paid for your comfort while she planned her wedding, and I never once asked for credit. But I won't be invisible anymore. Mom tried again. We were hoping this could be a fresh start. My heart ached, because deep down, a piece of me still wanted that. Still wanted the parents who cheered at recitals, who celebrated my small wins when no one else noticed. But those people had stopped showing up long ago. "This is my fresh start," I said, gesturing around me. "Right here, in a space that's mine, free of guilt and expectations." They stood there for a few more seconds, realizing this time I wasn't bluffing. I wasn't bending. "I wish things were different," Dad muttered. "So do I replied. "But wishing won't fix what you broke." I turned and walked back inside, closing the door gently. I didn't slam it. I didn't cry. I simply locked it and stood there, listening to the silence return like a gift. That night, I poured myself a glass of red wine, lit a candle, and sat in the living room alone. But it didn't feel lonely. It felt earned. Because peace, real peace, often comes not when everything's resolved, but when you finally stop fighting for the wrong people to see your worth. And I had finally done that. A few weeks passed, the quiet stretching out like a soft quilt I hadn't realized I needed. My phone stayed still. No surprise texts, no veiled accusations, just space, pure, uninterrupted space to finally breathe. Then one afternoon, tucked between a grocery coupon booklet and a utility bill, I found it. A handwritten envelope. No return address. just my name, scrawled in Naomi's familiar cursive. My hands hesitated, thumb poised over the flap. A part of me didn't want to open it, not because I feared what she'd say, but because I wasn't sure she deserved the attention anymore. Still, something in me, maybe the final thread of sisterhood that hadn't yet snapped, compelled me to break the seal. It was a letter, 2 pages. No apology in the first paragraph, not even in the second. Instead, she opened with memories, ones I'd long buried beneath adult responsibilities and invisible sacrifices. Remember when we used to build forts in the den? You always made the better roof. I kept reading. She acknowledged the house, said she didn't really know, that I had covered the mortgage all those years, that Mom and Dad handled everything, and she assumed I was just the big sister who helped here and there. That line made me pause. Helped here and there. I wanted to scoff. But the truth is, I had made it easy for them to think that. I paid bills quietly. I declined praise. I shrugged off thanks. Somewhere along the way, I taught them how to overlook me. Still, Naomi wrote that since coming back from her honeymoon, she'd started to see things differently. That Brandon, her husband, had asked why I wasn't in any of the wedding photos with our parents. That he noticed how no one toasted me, even though I funded half the celebration behind the scenes. She ended the letter like this: I don't expect forgiveness, and I'm not asking for anything, but if you ever want to talk, sister to sister, I'm here. No expectations, no guilt, just me. I read that line over and over. Just me. It was the first time she'd addressed me without comparison, without agenda, without the shadow of what I could give. I didn't cry. I didn't rush to call her back either. Instead, I folded the letter neatly and placed it in my journal. Not because I was ready to respond, but because for the first time in a long time, it felt like someone in that family had spoken to the real me. Later that night, I walked to the small park near my condo, the one with the skyline view and the bench I used to sit on when life got too loud. I watched the sun sink behind the buildings, a brushstroke of orange and rose across the sky. And I realized something. I could choose. I could decide who gets a seat at my table, who deserves access to my peace, who's earned the privilege of my vulnerability. Maybe Naomi had taken the first step, maybe not. But the next one? That one was mine to decide. The days after Naomi's letter felt strangely light. Not in a way that meant everything was fixed, because it wasn't, but in the way a deep breath feels after holding tension in your chest too long. I hadn't replied yet. I wasn't sure if I would, but just knowing the message had come without strings or demands made it feel different. Less like manipulation, more like the quiet beginning of something honest. That week, I started doing something I hadn't in a long time. I let myself dream forward. I took out the sketch pad I used to keep tucked in the back of my closet, the one I hadn't touched since my early 20s. Back when art was a refuge, before practicality and family pressure dimmed it into a luxury I couldn't afford. My fingers were shaky that first night. I sat at the dining table with a cup of tea and stared at the blank page for at least 30 minutes. But eventually, the lines came. First a rooftop view of the city skyline. Then a pair of hands, mine, holding a key. By the end of the week, I'd drawn a full series. Small snapshots of healing. A woman planting her own garden. A coffee mug resting on a window ledge. A closed door, with sunlight spilling beneath it. Each sketch was a reminder that I didn't need my family's approval to reclaim my life. And while I worked, a new idea began to form. Quiet at first, like a whisper I couldn't quite catch. But by Friday morning, I knew exactly what I wanted to do with it. I decided to start a community art project, one for people like me. People rebuilding from emotional wreckage. People who had been overlooked, erased, or told to be silent. I reached out to a few local art spaces and pitched the concept. To my surprise, one of them, a gallery in Northside I used to intern at, said yes. They loved the theme. Resilience through story. They offered wall space for rotating community pieces and even invited me to be the opening feature. I stood in that empty gallery space a few days later, breathing in the scent of fresh paint and possibility. And I realized something. This wasn't just about art. It was about creating a place where the unheard could finally be seen, including me. That night, I opened Naomi's letter again, but this time not to dwell on the pain of the past. I reread it as someone stepping into the future. And with a soft exhale, I picked up a pen and wrote just 2 lines on a clean sheet of paper. "Thank you for reaching out. I'm still figuring things out, but I'm open." I didn't know where it would lead. I didn't know if we could rebuild or if this was just a brief moment of clarity between 2 very different lives. But I did know this. I was no longer waiting to be chosen, invited, or accepted. I had finally chosen myself. The day of the gallery opening arrived quietly, without the drama or anxiety I had anticipated. It felt like stepping onto solid ground after years spent walking on shifting sands. The space was a cozy gallery tucked in Northside Austin, softly lit, warm and welcoming. Jenna had insisted on coming early to help me set up. She hung lights, straightened frames, and squeezed my hand whenever nerves threatened to unravel me. As evening settled, people began drifting in. Friends, former clients, fellow artists. I watched from the corner, half hidden behind my sketches, as visitors paused at each piece, nodding thoughtfully, whispering to one another. Then, halfway through the evening, a familiar silhouette appeared near the entrance. Naomi. She stood uncertainly, her eyes scanning the room until they finally landed on me. There was hesitation in her expression, a cautiousness I hadn't seen before. Brandon hovered behind her, one hand resting gently on her shoulder, protective yet uncertain. I approached slowly, meeting her halfway. "I wasn't sure you'd come," I said softly. "I wasn't sure you'd want me to," she admitted, voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm here because I want to understand. I want to see you, really see you." Emotion tightened my throat. How many years had I waited for those exact words? We moved together through the room, stopping at each drawing. She lingered longest at the image I'd titled Silent Strength, a simple sketch of clasped hands holding a fragile bloom, petals slightly bruised but beautiful. "This one," she said softly, eyes shimmering. "It's you, always holding everything together, even when it hurts." The admission made my chest ache, but for the first time it wasn't pain, it was release, recognition, a quiet validation I'd spent decades chasing. "I'm so sorry, Isabelle," she whispered. "For the house, for everything. I didn't see how much you carried, how much you sacrificed." I didn't answer right away. Instead, I let her words settle between us, absorbing their sincerity. "It's not just you," I finally said. "I taught everyone how to overlook me. But I'm done hiding now, and I don't want apologies, Naomi. I just want honesty." She nodded, understanding passing silently between us. It wasn't perfect. Wounds like ours don't mend overnight, but it felt like the start of something different, something healthier. As the night drew to a close, Jenna found me near the entrance, her arm looping through mine. "You did it," she said softly, "and you didn't need anyone else to get you here." I smiled, glancing around one more time at the sketches on the walls, each one a step toward reclaiming my story. She was right. I had found strength in the quiet places, rebuilt from ruins no one saw, and tonight I'd shared it openly, unapologetically, on my terms. Maybe the pieces of my family wouldn't fully fit together again. Maybe Naomi and I would remain cautious allies rather than close sisters, but that was okay. Because tonight, in a small gallery on the outskirts of Austin, surrounded by stories of resilience, I'd finally stepped fully into my own truth. And that was more than enough. In the weeks after the gallery show, life took on a gentle rhythm I'd forgotten was possible. My studio in East Austin buzzed with new commissions, clients drawn not just to my work, but to the honesty behind it. For the first time, I wasn't creating to prove my worth. I was creating simply because it felt right. On a sunlit Saturday morning, I stood at the counter of my favorite coffee shop near South Congress, waiting for my order, when a voice behind me gently said, "Excuse me, but aren't you Isabelle Carter?" I turned, startled, and found myself face to face with Ethan Reyes. I knew his name instantly. He was an architect whose elegant landscape designs had inspired some of my own sketches. His projects were featured often in Austin's style magazines, always described as thoughtful, grounded, and deeply personal. "I was at your gallery opening," he said softly, extending his hand with a smile that warmed his eyes. "Your work really resonated. It spoke to things I've felt but didn't quite know how to say." Something fluttered in my chest. It wasn't just the recognition. It was being seen clearly by someone whose work I deeply respected. We settled into a small table by the window, the sun tracing patterns between us as we talked. The conversation flowed effortlessly, shifting from art and architecture to deeper, quieter stories about family, boundaries, and the courage it takes to rebuild after loss. "I've been there," Ethan admitted quietly. "Always expected to be the strong one, holding things together without complaint. Eventually, I realized no one could see I was struggling because I never let them." His words resonated deeply, echoing my own story. But more than the similarity, I felt the genuine empathy behind them. It wasn't pity or platitudes, it was understanding, connection. As we parted, he hesitated, then handed me his card. "If you ever want to talk more, about anything, really, I'd like that." I walked back to my studio that day feeling lighter than I had in months. Something small yet significant had shifted. I wasn't isolated in my journey anymore. There were people who understood, who had walked through similar shadows and emerged stronger, more whole. When I stepped inside, Jenna was already there, rearranging samples and humming softly to the radio. She glanced up, noticing my expression. "What happened?" she asked, smiling knowingly. "I met someone," I said simply, unable to stop the warmth rising to my cheeks. "Well, about time," Jenna teased gently, pulling me into a hug. "You deserve to be seen for exactly who you are." Her words stayed with me long after she'd left. It wasn't just Ethan's interest or Jenna's unwavering friendship. It was the quiet, certain feeling growing within me that my worth wasn't conditional. It wasn't tied to sacrifice or silent endurance. It was something intrinsic, unbreakable, and mine alone. That evening, I placed Ethan's card carefully in my journal, next to Naomi's letter. Two very different connections, one rooted in shared wounds, the other in shared healing. Both equally valuable, both part of my story now. As I closed the journal, I felt something I'd longed for my entire life but never fully claimed until now. I belonged, first and foremost, to myself. In the months that followed, I began to truly understand what it meant to reclaim my story. Life took on colors I'd missed for so long, vibrant, unapologetic shades of peace and clarity. One Saturday afternoon, as sunlight warmed the brick walls of my East Austin studio, I laid out a series of new sketches. They weren't commissions or practical projects, but quiet visions I'd carried within myself for years, dreams I'd shelved in favor of duty, responsibility, and silent sacrifice. Among them was a design I'd never dared to consider seriously. A house. Not just any house, but one I'd create for myself, with spaces that spoke directly to my soul. It wasn't about impressing clients or family anymore. It was about creating a sanctuary where every corner felt genuinely mine. I found myself reaching for Ethan's card, dialing his number before nerves could interrupt. He answered on the second ring, voice warm with gentle surprise. "Isabelle." "I have an idea," I began softly, heart pounding. "Something I've wanted to do for a long time, and you're the only one I trust with it." He came by the studio later that day, standing quietly by my drafting table as I showed him each sketch, voice shaking slightly with excitement and vulnerability. He listened intently, nodding, eyes thoughtful. "This is more than a house," he said softly when I finished. "It's a declaration." His words resonated deeply. It was exactly that, a declaration of independence, of healing, and finally, of living for myself. Together, over weeks of careful planning, our vision took shape. Every line, every material, every space chosen deliberately, not for anyone else's approval, but purely for the joy and authenticity they brought me. Meanwhile, Naomi and I started meeting occasionally for coffee, slowly, cautiously rebuilding a connection that felt different now, healthier. She was quieter these days, more reflective. She talked openly about therapy, about trying to understand our parents' choices and her role in perpetuating their patterns. "I never realized how much pressure you carried," she confessed softly one afternoon, eyes earnest. "I always assumed you were just naturally strong. I'm so sorry." I didn't rush to dismiss her apology or reassure her that it was fine, because it wasn't. Instead, I simply accepted her honesty and held it gently between us. Because that was part of healing too, accepting genuine accountability from others without diminishing myself. Construction began on the house in late spring, on a small plot near Zilker Park, land I'd quietly saved for without ever fully believing I'd get here. Ethan stood beside me the day we broke ground, his hand a steady comfort on mine, a reminder that this journey was something I'd chosen intentionally and completely for myself. As I watched the foundation slowly take shape, it struck me how symbolic it all was. Not just building a physical home, but laying the groundwork for a future defined by my own choices, free from guilt, obligation, or invisibility. I was finally stepping fully into the light, claiming the space I'd deserved all along. And standing there, beneath the soft Austin sun, I felt something profound settle within me, a peace I'd long searched for but had finally found within myself. Standing in the doorway of my newly built home near Zilker Park, I finally felt the weight of years lift off my shoulders. The walls, painted in warm earth tones I chose myself, seemed to breathe with the stories I carried and the freedom I'd claimed. This house wasn't just a structure of wood and stone. It was the embodiment of every sacrifice, every tear, every moment I'd chosen to stand up for myself rather than be invisible. Looking back on the journey, from the sting of betrayal when my parents gave away the house I paid for, to the quiet nights spent rebuilding my sense of worth, it's clear that family isn't always the safe harbor we hope for. Sometimes the people closest to us hurt us the most, whether intentionally or not. But I learned that pain isn't the end of the story. It can be the beginning of something stronger. I learned that boundaries aren't selfish, they're essential. They protect not only our peace, but also our capacity to love without losing ourselves. I learned that healing often comes in imperfect steps, with stumbles and setbacks, but every step forward is progress. Most importantly, I learned to choose myself, to value my worth not by the approval of others, but by the respect I give myself. To anyone listening who's felt overlooked or taken for granted, whether by family, friends, or even yourself, know this: your story matters. Your feelings are valid. Your boundaries are necessary. You don't have to stay silent or sacrifice your well-being to be loved. Choosing yourself is not just an act of courage, it's an act of self-love that sets the foundation for authentic relationships and lasting happiness. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If my story resonated with you, please subscribe, like, and share so we can continue to explore the power of healing and self-discovery together. And I'd love to hear your experiences in the comments below. What boundaries have you set, and how has choosing yourself changed your life? Remember, your peace is worth fighting for.